You're listening to episode 199 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Karen Maezen Miller joins us to speak about her new book, Paradise in Plain Sight, Lessons from a Zen Garden. The surface of every moment contains the infinite depths of Zen. We see this in practice with the tea ceremony. We capture it with haiku, with the music of the shakuhachi flute you're hearing at this moment, with every breath we take and the single fallen leaf. We experience it in places too, those physical manifestations of Zen, and in the work to create the space of a Zen garden. Karen Maezen Miller is the author of Hand Wash Cold, Mama Zen, and most recently, Paradise in Plain Sight. She's also a Zen Buddhist priest, meditation teacher, wife, and mother. I would also like to thank our old friend Kim Corbin of New World Library for arranging today's interview. So sit back, relax, and have a nice ocha. And our guest today is Karen Maezen Miller. Maezen, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So we're here today to talk about your new book, just coming out, Paradise in Plain Sight, Lessons from a Zen Garden. But first, if you could tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, sometimes I feel as if I've had a million lives, but at least in this incarnation, I've had two, and there was a clear turning point for me in my life. The first part of my life, I used to say my only religion was capitalism. I was really a hard worker and, an achiever, and I applied myself in my youth to building a business and acquiring property and relationships, service, and all kinds of other sane-making activities were secondary, but I had my own public relations business in Houston, Texas. And I was approaching, I guess, my 35th year or so, and I up and disposed of my first marriage because I judged it to be not working for me. I found that although I had, I would say, achieved some status and certainly had a nice savings account from my long years of labor, I was completely unfulfilled and ungratified by my work. At this point, I no longer had faith in those things that I thought were worthwhile. And my life really seemed to fall apart. I had a hard time making it through a day, I'll say that much. I found I didn't have the friends or allies, or I hesitate to say spiritual because I really was not oriented to the spiritual, but I just didn't find that I had anything operative in my life that could help me manage. And this is actually rather textbook, so I'm almost embarrassed to say it now. We all, as we approach middle life, might have an opportunity to fall apart. And so I seemed to be failing at everything that I had previously excelled at. And I had yet another failed relationship, and I was involved with a fellow who happened to profess an interest in Zen Buddhism, which I found to be absurd. A total waste of time, rather grim and very dark, and I was terrified of it, to tell you the truth. But I pacified that since I really wanted to be loved. But when our relationship ended, I was kind of cut loose. I found that antidepressants really didn't work for me. I, was seeing a counselor and relying on my friends to get me through a lot of sleepless nights. And then one day I found a book on my shelf in my home, a series of books actually that had been left behind by this friend who had left. And the first one was the Tao Te Ching. And I couldn't say the name, who can really? But it was a red spine, a slender red spine, a translation by Stephen Mitchell. I mean, is that really, do you need any more evidence of the Dharma that's, always at work in your life, that the most accessible translation of the Tao Te Ching was right on the shelf by my back door? And I opened it up one night because I suffered from insomnia. And I read the whole thing. And I was just gripped, kind of transported by the truth, by what I heard as the truth. Now, I was a good Lutheran girl from Texas. And by good Lutheran girl, I mean I was really kind of a bad Lutheran girl. I really didn't have any belief. And I felt fraudulent, in my practice of Christianity, so I didn't practice it. But nonetheless, I read that, and I was hooked. I picked up another book, and they were all on my shelf, Ted. So I just picked up another and another and another, and I found myself kind of suddenly, up to my ankles and up to my knees. Soon I was up to my hips in this thing that I really was trying to avoid. I took yoga, and when I went to the yoga class, what I was really interested in was in the meditation. And I asked the yoga teacher, this is in the middle of Houston, I asked him who his teacher was. And, now I realize that I was somehow asking these questions that would really get me kind of back to a root, a source, a tradition. So I folded up a bed pillow, and I sat like I had seen my friend sit, and I sat for 3 minutes. And I know it was 3 minutes because I wrote it down. It seemed so significant. And then I just kept doing that. But certain that I was not doing it the right way, or that I was missing some essential piece of instruction, feeling, as we always do, that I was such a fake. I recalled what this guy had said one time that I had promptly ignored. He had said, well, if I ever have the time, this is one of those things we say, don't we, about our lives, if I ever have the time, I'm going to go out to California and sit with Maezen Roshi, because he's the greatest living Zen master of the 20th century. This was in the 20th century, by the way. So I remembered him saying that and having no basis for doing anything. I couldn't evaluate it. I wasn't interested in finding out about Zen. I just picked up the phone one day, which is what you had to do in those days. And I called out to the Zen Center of Los Angeles, and I said, is there somebody there who can show me how to sit? And, now I know that probably sounds, well, you get all kinds. And they said, well, yes, we have a beginner's retreat coming up, and they listed these dates in September, and I said, well, I guess I'll come. Because one of the things I'd realized is that in my life, which I thought was so tormented and such a prison, it had so little option or recourse in it, that I was in charge, and I could go wherever I wanted to. So I went out to California, and I went out for what I thought was a beginner's retreat. And, anybody who's ever been to a beginner's retreat right away realizes that it is death by, zazen. It's not a beginner's retreat. So I went out and sat my first retreat, and for some reason, Maezumi at that time didn't sit the beginner's retreats. He didn't stay in the city for those retreats. He went out every weekend to the mountain center where his family lived. But he was there that weekend, and I was assigned to his house as a guest, and he woke me up every morning knocking on my door at 3:30 in the morning. And so I had this encounter with Maezen Roshi, knowing not a single thing about him, except that I found him to be just a very remarkable individual and possessed of this, what I had never seen before, both levity and gravity. And he was both serious and he was tender and sweet. And that's kind of how it started. I made it through that weekend, and I went back as soon as I could. And then my life unfolded after that.
Yeah, you went on then to become a teacher in your own right and have had a stable, ongoing practice for many years thereafter.
Oh, yeah. It seems like, forever. But I think I'm coming up on an anniversary pretty soon. I started my practice in 1993. So let's see, you do the math. But I think that's 21 years.
Yeah, so it's about the same time for me. Yep. So tell us a little bit about, let's fast forward to this Zen garden. In the very beginning of your book, you describe the background circumstances of how you first encountered it and its state at that time. Tell us a little bit of that story.
Well, when last I left you, I was still living in Texas, and I was commuting to practice with Maezen Roshi in Los Angeles. And as it turned out, I ended up meeting a fellow who lived in Los Angeles, and we dated, and then ultimately we married. He lived in California, and I lived in Texas. In some ways, Ted, it was the perfect relationship. But at this point, I was, close to 40 or something, around that, and something kicked in, and I really felt that I wanted to make a home and have a family. And so we argued about where that might happen. And I made a trip to this little town called Sierra Madre, which is where my husband had been living for some time. And we were very ambivalent about which direction we were going to take. So naturally, we weren't looking for anything to buy. We were looking for a rental property. And we spent all day, looking at rental houses. And it's a small town I live in, and it's very turn of the century. It's very quaint, like Mayberry. But we struck bottom. We had no option. And so the real estate agent pulled us up to this place on a street, and she was about to take us back to our cars, and we were going to call it a day and have no decision moving forward. We were going to stay in that state of limbo, which is where we were. And she pulled up to this house, and there was a large, old, rusted wrought iron fence that lined the whole property line from the curb, and it's on a hillside, so the curb up the street toward the mountain. And it was, I say, curtained by this stand of giant bamboo, which you've seen in the video, and you can't see through it. So here we were standing on the edge of something that we could not see inside, had no idea what was inside. Step by step, we walked through this derelict old Japanese-style garden gate and down a path and bordered by fruit trees. And there was a little itty-bitty bungalow, a house that, didn't look like anything special. But I was transfixed because the smells and the colors, it all seemed so familiar to me. I'd grown up in California, and I recognized the smell of the dirt and the way the dry air smells and the oranges. My grandfather grew oranges, so I was a little suspicious at this point that we might be someplace that I would recognize. And we came into this house. It was empty. It had been empty for some time. They'd had trouble selling it. And stepping into the kitchen right inside the front door, there was a huge plate glass window, and looking out, we saw this garden, this amazing. It seemed huge, this old-style Japanese garden. And what I recalled at the moment of seeing it was that Maezen Roshi, before his death, which was then, I guess, about 4 years earlier to this occasion, had told me that he had been a gardener in Sierra Madre when he first came to America. So I was really sensing that this had to have been the place. And I was crying, my husband realized what this meant. I mean, we knew in our bones that we would need to buy it, right away, that this is where we were going to end up. It just seemed like you were arriving in the middle of a story that was already written, and it was your life. So we didn't have any notion of what a Japanese garden was, the symbolism meant, how to care for plants. I say in this book, the only thing I'd ever grown was mold on bread. But we came back the next day and to sign the contract, and we sat in the garden. And frankly, to our uninitiated eyes, it looked perfect. I mean, it was green. It just, beauty really can't be defined and shouldn't be. So that was our initial romance with the garden. And within about 2 months, I had relocated here. My husband was here. We owned the property, and we started to work. And that's when, the garden is your teacher. The garden tells you. The garden shows you. It's an intuitive, visceral relationship. It's real. And right away, we realized that the garden needed a lot of work and a lot of money. It was covered with invasive ivy, and the ponds, there are 4 interconnected ponds. We thought the ponds were dysfunctional and probably broken. It's 100 years old. The garden is 100 years old. It was put in 1916. And on the one hand, it has tremendous stability and longevity. I stopped worrying immediately that I would hurt the garden. But anything that's 100 years old needs restoration, and there are things to be patched and fixed, and it needs a loving hand. It needs a companion, a constant companion. So that became my job. I used to say right away, I had retired from my other job or quit my other job, and I said my day job is sweeping up paradise.
As you go through the book itself, the story gradually unfolds about what you discover there in the garden and in its upkeep and the progress of that ongoing work. And you use the garden as a theme underneath, but really throughout, this is a book on Buddhism, on Zen, on practice.
Yes, it is.
Did you find yourself, as you were doing the work, with a full and present awareness so that this is the practice unfolding before me? Is that something that would come to you at the end of the day afterwards or sometime later?
No, it didn't come to me. It was just my life. And I didn't think about it. And I wasn't looking for metaphor or allegory. I wasn't looking for meaning. And actually, to live your practice, that's how you live your practice. So, no, this was something that I had, frankly, overlooked. I had overlooked the structure and the significance until I was asked if I would write about the garden. It never occurred to me to write about the garden. I'm not a gardener. I mean, I say that. I have no expertise. I have no information to share. But I was asked if I could use the garden to, I always, in my books, Ted, I write about my life. And some might perceive it as spiritual memoir, but it's practice. Every bit of it, is practice. And in examining it, what I'm doing is extracting for myself the teaching, the lesson that was already there. I try not to add, anything to it. But at this point in both my practice life and my writing life, I was very clear that it was time for me to write. I even called it a practice manual, in which I became more confident and straightforward about my lineage, the practice, and my role in it. And so the challenge for me was stepping up and being as direct as you have perceived. So I'm very glad to hear that you, because of your practice, you see that. So I don't try to do this, but I have many different kinds of audiences, and more they are practitioners who want me to present them with this kind of a teaching. At the same time, people who read the book who may be gardeners will find, encouragement and inspiration and humor in it. I don't want to exclude anyone from their own experience of the garden. And they'll have it, they'll find it. But yes, for me, this is where I am in my practice life and where I am in my life. Somebody has to be the priest.
Maezen, in the process of developing and working in the garden, what were some of the things that stood up most for you as aha moments, or things that were very inspiring to you in your practice of working in the garden?
Well, one of the things I write about is something that happened early on. We've been here 16 years, or maybe now close to 17. I don't do any calculations, so I mentioned that one of the things, we were just overwhelmed initially and we just assumed everything was flawed and had to be redone, or that we needed careful tutelage so that we wouldn't ruin things. And we felt like there was something wrong with our ponds. We have about 7,500 square feet of water. And as I mentioned, the garden is 100 years old, so it's not fancy, and it doesn't have the kind of infrastructure that you might find at a koi pond, say in a restaurant or even on a college campus, which is really pristine, like the kind of ponds that are on the cover of the Holmes magazine. We thought, ours is just, something's terribly wrong because the water is so brown. And we have algae. And it looks like there's mud and scum, in the bottom of the pond. So we got a referral to someone who was a pond guy. You always want to have a pond guy. And we felt like as soon as he saw the state of our ponds that he would right away, tell us everything we were doing wrong, because it wasn't pretty. And, it wasn't the right color, or maybe the fish were sick or what. And so he came out, and everybody always, when they visit the garden, they're struck dumb. And he walked around the circumference of the ponds, and he saw we have a stream that feeds the ponds, that recirculates the water, and 2 waterfalls. And here I'm describing all this, and you can think, well, my goodness, what can be wrong with a place that was that ingeniously and carefully designed and its natural state? And essentially what he did is he walked around and he said, what did you say your problem was? And we said, well, it's muddy. Again, because we were coming from an understanding, a view that was idealized, of what purity is. That we have to be able to see clear to the bottom, and that there's no dirt. And he then described for us how every single element of this garden, when it's functioning, creates this natural purification system, and that the mud is what keeps the water balanced and, feeds the fish, and, all of these things that we had decided were flaws were just this exquisite system of purification. And that's how it works. Don't hold on to any notion of what your pond is supposed to look like, or what's a perfect pond, or what does it smell like or look like. Or if you will just allow, and I hate to say even the thought, if you will just accept that things work naturally, harmoniously, as they are, absent your judgment, and any need to kind of fix it. So that was a wonderful day. We never needed to call the guy back. But we did have to take his advice to let every part of this system, that kind of the ecology that is our garden, work the way it works, and to watch that it's working, and then to trust that it works. And, and it does. That was the ponds. But, it's all everywhere, all over you. You learn about seasons and time, You learn about love and sorrow. Just learn at everything just by looking outside your window. And actually, better than that, getting out into it. Because when you're in the middle of the garden doing what I do for a little bit every day, which is mostly pulling weeds and picking up dog poop, nothing really fancy, the small jobs that don't get you any glory. When you do that, when you really do that and make it part of your life, you no longer judge it. It's not apart from you. It's not separate from you. It's not a project. It's just your life. And it's beautiful.
It is. It's interesting that this concept of wabi-sabi might not be pristine, but is nonetheless filled with wonder.
Absolutely. There's such the patina, the aging, the falling apart. I mean, in the scale that we have here, we couldn't get ahead of it if we tried. But the trying to get ahead of things is sure to breed anxiety.
Yeah, it's a difficult concept that people often trip up on, even in non-Buddhist contexts when they're just doing mindfulness practice in a separate program, just this non-striving.
Yes. Well, Maezen said the effort of no effort is the hardest effort of all. So let's be clear. It really does take intention. And then, you have to catch yourself and you have to come back and you have to catch yourself and you have to come back. And what you're coming back to is the release, the release, the release. My teacher now says, quoting Yan Wu says, our practice is to relax and release. Relax and release. Now, how often do you ever actually feel like that on a cushion? Not that often, because you're trying to produce something. But now, after 20 years of practice, I think I'm just ready to begin relaxing.
Yeah, it's interesting that when we start our practice, and I noticed this in the Zen tradition, in my own experience, it was very exhausting to do the retreats and all that, and you often came out of it more wound up than when you went in. And it's only when you start not having that inner critic and that template of accomplishing something, and you let go, that then you embed in the practice.
Now, if you would really, really exhaust yourself, yeah, you would have exhausted that critical mind. And then that's no problem when you've exhausted the critical mind. And for me, sometimes they would, day 3 or day 4 or something, I would, go into an interview with the teacher, and this is prescribed, you state your name, and I say that every time I go in. After 21 years, I state my name. But maybe on the 3rd or the 4th day, or maybe the 5th day, I forget to say my name. And then, somebody might tell you, oh, that's good. Go ahead and forget.
Self is extinguishing right before your not self.
Well, at least, you're in some new territory there, the land of forgetting, which is not a bad place to be.
So, Maezen, what are some things that you're hoping someone reading the book will get out of it? What are you hoping that will inspire them?
Well, I've extinguished hope, Ted. Well, just in the most practical way, I'll say I really do want people to come see the garden. And I mean, literally, I want people to come see the garden. I want people to come to my backyard. And why? Because this old girl, and I mean the garden, has been waiting 100 years. So I do want visitors to come. That may seem insane, but it'll work itself out. I don't really have ambition. I hope that isn't false when I say that, but I can't pretend to know. Although I'll just tell you that my experience of writing, I hope it comes through. In my experience of writing, I start out and I feel that I should grapple with something or resolve something or delve into something, some issue, that's not apart from my life, like age, or loss or patience or, whatever. I'm looking at something, and I hope, I shouldn't even say hope. I know I've finished a chapter when I have found some peace. So I love it when people say to me, and I don't even need to know why or how. I hope they don't know why or how. They say, I found peace. They themselves, only a reader who's looking into the mirror will recognize the parts that you really resonate with them. And when I say that, it's not because I feel like I have something to offer, I want to save anybody, but for me, in a selfish way, that's my community and that connection. It's as good as it gets from a distance to be able to hear from somebody who says, me too. And they can find the garden in their own life. I sat a retreat in Ohio just a month or so ago with some folks who, from all over, I'm not real familiar with geography, but all over, way over there, wherever Ohio is. And at the very end of the retreat, someone came in to see me, and what she said was, now I know that if I can go home and see my family without judgment, I'm going to see how beautiful they are. And that's what I'm going to do. And I was bowled over. I thought, well, that was worth the flight. That was worth the 3 days. That was worth packing a suitcase for, that someone can get that kind of personal insight.
Yeah, how wonderful to just have that moment with someone else that this has touched.
Yeah, it's priceless. It's called the treasury. It's 3 treasures. The treasury is it's a treasury. It's a jewel. To, out of your own eyes, see what's really been here, what's here, as it is. And that's also someone I know who, having touched that, she's just turned herself into a practitioner. So, that's a good day.
Well, our guest today has been Karen Maezen Miller, and the book is Paradise in Plain Sight, Lessons from a Zen Garden. We'll be linking that and her other books on the episode page for this episode, as well as her website, www.karenmaezenmiller.com. Maezen, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.